Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy so that wherever you go, even at 6-foot distance or through a breathing apparatus that blocks the spittle, you can still espouse smart conservative principles. And it's so daunting these days as we watch protesters and what could be feigned and implied violence against anyone who stands against reparational socialism, but we try to lay it out for you here so that you know what you're thinking of and vetting as candidates come visiting with you as well. Our first guest this week, research fellow in economics, budget, and entitlements for the Heritage Foundation, Rachel Greszler, is on the line with us talking about COVID-19 bailouts and deficits that have come from them, including the states and their issues with some of the bailout requirements and mandates in there. Rachel, thank you for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Joe. Thank you for having me.
So I can't help but feel like the bureaucracy really outdid itself in how poorly managed the COVID-19 crisis has been. Rarely do I see such a shining example of how a bureaucracy can't help but get in its own way of just doing what its purported purpose is. And you've got CARES Act mandates that were supposed to keep people from losing their job, and then unemployment bailouts for all the people who lost their jobs anyway or had them furloughed for extended periods of time. It became a mess wrapped in another mess covered in chocolate sauce. So how do we dig our way out of this mess and hopefully learn lessons from it so if we ever face a crisis like this, we don't do it again?
Yeah, well, and I think what we've seen here is that while the federal government attempted to act quickly, nevertheless, this was not necessarily something that could be done with a one-size-fits-all government policy. And so some of the health stuff justifiably was done on the federal side. But really looking at the state and local governments, they are the ones that are better positioned to be making the decisions about what's best for their local residents, their businesses, based on their own experiences. Because we know that New York City is very different than a small town in Iowa, and they're not both under the same situations. And yet now we are seeing the states coming and saying, we want a federal bailout. A lot of us, most of them are experiencing big budget shortfalls as a result of the lost incomes and just the economic impact. But the problem with those bailouts is that you would just be rewarding bad behavior. And in many cases, we're not talking about impacts just from COVID-19 in a couple months, but we're talking about problems that have been decades in the making that politicians have repeatedly failed to acknowledge. And now they're looking to use COVID-19 to cover up those past reckless choices and to just say that federal taxpayers as a whole will shoulder the cost. But we know that when you socialize state budgets, it's kind of like when you go out to eat with a group and you split the tab, everyone's still going to end up paying.
Right.
It's just that you're going to end up paying more because everyone's going to be inclined to order more expensive meals when they only have to pay for a fraction of the cost.
Let me ask you this, and you nailed it when you pointed out that a lot of these states that are looking for federal bailout were already in trouble. It's like that relative that is constantly getting new credit cards and constantly running up debt, and then all of a sudden, a crisis hits or a healthcare crisis hits, and they really go under from it. And your heart breaks for them, and you want to, but it's not like you and me and the Heritage Foundation and all of us here at the Virginia Institute haven't been trying to point out these problems for some time. Now, in Virginia, we have things like the issues with the deficit in the Virginia retirement system, and it's gotten a little bit better, but it hasn't gotten a lot better. But we do manage to have a rainy day fund. A lot of folks ask me why the Virginia General Assembly didn't address this in the budget. They need the budget to fall 25% from revenue before the rainy day fund can be cracked into. I don't know if that was the most courageous answer, but it certainly was an answer established by the fact that we set up a rainy day fund in the first place.
Yeah, and so you see great disparity in the amount of funds that states had saved in rainy day funds over the last decade. And going into this crisis, you had states like Texas and Wyoming who had very large amounts sitting in there. I think Wyoming had enough revenue to cover an entire year's worth of expenses. And on the other hand, Illinois had enough money in its rainy day fund to operate for 15 minutes. And that's just kind of characteristic of states like Illinois, who have been facing budget shortfalls and just repeatedly having deficits, issuing new bonds to cover their pension obligations, and they've simply failed to address these. And even amid COVID-19, as we see other states enacting budget-saving measures, whether it's a hiring freeze or a pay freeze or no COLA increase this year, Illinois is not doing anything. They just passed another $6 billion deficit, and they're simply counting on the federal government for a bailout to cover that.
Where does this end? I mean, we're staring down the barrel of a $30 trillion budget deficit, which, as I do the math, is sort of all the money that's gone into the war on poverty since 1965. But that being said, we're looking at a deficit that's eye-popping to this. I can already hear opponents of any Republican candidate for Congress saying, I thought you were all budget hawks and you hated deficits. The president is about the only Republican I know of that never campaigned on the idea of I hate deficits or debt. He's always claimed that he can work with it. But it's going to damage the value of the dollar. We've always talked about that. It weakens the value of the dollar. It weakens our buying power of each dollar that we earn. Each hour we work gains us less value for it. And at some point, the chickens of the reserve currency may come home to roost, and then we're really in trouble, aren't we, Rachel?
Yes, and that's the big point here is when you can keep racking up deficits and our debt, now exceeding 100% of our economy, which we know from studies is past the tipping point of declining growth. And it just creates this enormous risk. It's like we're walking on eggshells and you just don't know what's going to make it crack. But once it cracks, it's opened up. And it's not like, we need to cut 5% here and do these little changes around the margins and we'll be okay. No, once you hit a fiscal crisis, you have to enact massive reforms. Mm-hmm. And so if we were to address them today, before we get to that crisis point, you can do a lot more with less. Yet, looking at situations like Greece and Puerto Rico, if you wait until the crisis hits, that's when it's going to bring about the greatest hardships and really set us back potentially decades.
We're visiting with Rachel Greszler. She's the research fellow in economics, budget, and entitlements for the Heritage Foundation this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Rachel, I grew up in New York City in the 70s, and I'm not saying that so that you'd be nice to me because I'm old, but I grew up in New York in the 70s when the biggest city with the most vibrant economy, with the most cash flow of any city in at least the United States, if not one of the top 5 in the world, went bankrupt. It had to be run by the state. The city was completely collapsed. And we had monthly sanitation strikes. It's where the phrase the blue flu was invented because the police unions wanted to go on strike, but they couldn't. Firefighters were struggling to get new contracts. We had firehouses closing and dangerous situations. I worry about that extrapolating nationally with so many of the things. If we go into a bankruptcy kind of mode nationally, I can just imagine these things happening on a national scale.
Yeah, and the problem is if it happens on a national scale, who's there above the United States to help out? When it happened in New York, you have some federal oversight that comes and steps in and helps address it. Somewhat of a bankruptcy-like situation, although I know that wasn't the case in New York. I happen to have grown up on the opposite end of the state, closer to Buffalo, New York in the
Oh
80s and
boy.
90s. So fortunately, I didn't have to go through what you were going through. But you point out that you don't want to be in that type of situation. So what can the states and the local governments do now if they're facing these shortfalls? Many of them are from COVID-19, but there are also longstanding shortfalls in many cases. And that's where, the states need to just sit down like the average family is today at the kitchen table and do budgeting and say, what can we do to scale back in the places that we've expanded? We need to get things opened up and have a priority on daycares and schools so that people can be getting back to work. Looking at the public sector compensation, that's a huge area for reform, and it's one of the driving costs of many states' fiscal situations.
Well, where would be the places? Obviously, entitlements is part of your pigeon at the Heritage Foundation, Rachel. And so, obviously, we have our mandates of Social Security, Medicare. But I mean, are there savings? I keep hearing the doomsayers say, "Oh, that's 90% of the budget right there." So you're only working within 5% of the margins.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest things that I think the state and local governments need to address is their public sector pension benefits. It's hard because you have effectively grandfathered in a lot of payments from decades in the past when politicians chose to just make promises and not actually put the money where their mouth was to make good on those. But nevertheless, if you don't address them now, the situation just balloons over time, and there are enormous level of liabilities that are out there. But this is a case where you can benefit both the state government and its efficiency as well as those public sector workers, because who wants to have an empty pension promise when they could instead have a retirement account that they see, that they own, that they can walk away and go into private sector employment and not worry about losing half of their benefits. So this could be a mutually beneficial exchange.
I was thinking the exact same thing. Those couple of years I worked in Amherst must have, impacted me well. Here we are, positive thinking conservatives in America, and we've rooted for the Buffalo Bills. So, Rachel, do you think there's the political will as we watch our cities burning? And I sit here and I've pointed out, I've referred to this as mourning in the Great Society. Lyndon Johnson started all these entitlement programs and these welfare programs in 1965, ostensibly to stop the poor black communities that had watched their jobs leave from rioting and burning out big swaths of these downtown areas. And here we are. We've gone 55 years, spent well into the $20 trillion, more money than we've spent on all of our military engagements, actual military engagements put together on our war on poverty, and we still have riots and burnings in our downtown areas. I don't know if we can put the genie back in the bottle right now until we quell some of the unrest, but I worry that we're going to have another Lyndon Johnson come out with Great Society 2.
Yes, and we obviously have to address the issues of the day and confront those problems. But as you point out, we've done all this, and yet in many ways we're facing similar issues. And I think this is where we point to, individual liberty and creating opportunities, fostering the types of environments that will help people to thrive, rather than pigeonholing them into government solutions that say, if you follow this, and if you can qualify for this program, here's what you can get, instead of letting individuals pursue, what is their, driving ambition, and let them just have the opportunities that are out there. In so many cases, I see the response from the left trying to shut down things that we know would actually help people and allow them to experience the freedom and the independence, not feeling like they have to be reliant on somebody else, because we know that doesn't contribute to personal happiness and flourishing. And so I do hope that there will be some political will out there to kind of change the course, in terms of the individual liberty we give people, and also just the size of our government and the debt that we're creating for future generations is really a scary situation.
One of the things I think we need, and I've often said, boy, I'd love a day when my daily radio show or this radio show could get into things like movie reviews or food critique or more essential things that hit people every day than the political wranglings. I think it almost takes a generation of politicians who don't want to be in the spotlight to set these things in motion and then disappear into the shadows and let the economy grow without having to be on CNN or CNBC once every couple of days.
Yeah, and you point out a significant problem. Even when we do have politicians who get there with the right ambitions and don't want to be in the spotlight and just want to do the right thing, oftentimes they don't end up being there for long. They're voted out of office by people who want to criticize them. Say they're taking things away when really they're trying to give more freedom and opportunity. So it's a tough spot, and I can't say I have a solution for that.
Yeah, I think there just has to be an ability to acknowledge the fact that not doing things. I've argued that sometimes I wonder if the phrase conservative is apt anymore. We need to be a restorative, and I think it's a racing parlance when you hear a race car driver saying you've got to slow down to go faster. But that's what our politicians need to do. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for your time and your analysis, and I hope you get a chance to get back home from D.C. and have a beef on WEC, and we will talk to you again very soon.
I've already been back for the buffalo wings.
Thank you. All right. Well, to the Anchor Bar you go. Thank you so much. Rachel Greszler, research fellow. Find her stuff at heritage.org, and she works on budget and spending and entitlements. You have a wonderful weekend, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
What happens when a business owner pushes back against the governor's mask law and the Virginia Department of Health Police? We'll meet attorney Matt Harden next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.